Look under your car! The woman's voice cut through the autumn air like a gunshot. 23-year-old Janelle Doyle, trembling on the sidewalk curb, faced a man the entire city knew better than to cross. Dominic Santoro, the Don, tattooed, impeccably dressed, a man who'd controlled the city's underworld for a decade with calculated ruthlessness. But Janelle had heard something moments ago that made her blood run cold. Now Santoro was reaching for his car door, completely unaware. And across the park, hidden among the late afternoon crowd, rival assassins watched with cold patience. Janelle had seconds to decide. Stay silent and invisible, or speak truth and risk the violent wrath of both the man she was warning and the killers waiting for him to die. Her next move would either save a life or ignite a war that would consume the city's streets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's rewind 37 minutes to when Janelle's day had still been ordinary and her greatest concern had been whether she could make it home without having to speak to anyone. The November sun hung low over Riverside Park with the kind of pale golden light that made shadows stretch long across the pavement. It was just past 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, and the temperature had dropped to a crisp 52 degrees. Janelle walked with her head down, her canvas messenger bag heavy against her hip, filled with photocopied research documents and a half-eaten granola bar she'd forgotten about during lunch. Her route home from the museum took her along the park's eastern edge, a deliberate choice that avoided the crowded main streets and their uncomfortable requirement for eye contact with strangers. Today had been particularly difficult. A visiting scholar had questioned her cataloging methodology in front of her supervisor, his voice dripping with condescension as he implied she'd misattributed a Civil War-era letter. She'd been right, of course. Her research had been meticulous, but standing there in the archive room with both men staring at her, waiting for her to defend herself, her voice had simply vanished. The familiar tightness had gripped her chest, her hands had started shaking, and she'd managed only a whispered, "I'll double-check," before retreating to the bathroom to breathe through a panic attack. She'd spent the rest of the afternoon re-verifying what she already knew was correct, sending her supervisor a carefully worded email with citations and cross-references, avoiding any further face-to-face interaction. It was always like this. Her brain worked perfectly well in isolation, but the moment human confrontation entered the equation, everything short-circuited. Janelle's therapist called it social anxiety disorder. Her mother called it shyness. Janelle called it exhausting. She pulled her denim jacket tighter as a breeze scattered oak leaves across the pathway. The park was moderately busy with the usual Thursday afternoon crowd. Joggers with expensive headphones, elderly couples walking slowly arm in arm, a handful of students sprawled on blankets despite the chill, probably skipping afternoon classes. Janelle envied their casual ease, the way they occupied space without apology. She was so focused on her own thoughts, on mapping the quietest route to her apartment 3 blocks away, that she didn't notice the man until he collided with her. The impact wasn't violent, just a sudden shoulder check that sent her stumbling sideways into the wrought iron fence that bordered the pathway. Her bag swung wildly, and she grabbed the fence to steady herself, an apology already forming on her lips even though he'd clearly walked into her. Sorry, the man muttered, his voice tight with stress. He was in his 40s, dressed in an ill-fitting jacket and khakis, with sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the cool temperature, his eyes were wide, darting, and his hands shook as he bent down to retrieve something he'd dropped. A phone, a cheap flip phone, the kind people called burners. It had clattered onto the concrete pathway, its clamshell design sprung open, the faint glow of an active call visible on its tiny screen. The man snatched it up with jerky, panicked movements, pressing it to his ear as he hurried past Janelle without another word. She watched him go, her heart rate elevated from both the collision and the oddness of his behavior. He disappeared around a cluster of trees, his voice carrying back in urgent, hushed tones. Janelle took a breath, adjusted her bag, and was about to continue walking when she noticed something on the ground where the man had been standing. Another phone, identical to the first. Also open. Also with a glowing screen indicating an active call. She stared at it, confused. Why would someone carry two identical burner phones? The device lay there on the concrete, its small speaker emitting the faintest sound. Janelle glanced around. The man was gone, already lost in the park's foot traffic. She should just leave it, walk away, it wasn't her business. But something about the man's panic, the sweat, the trembling hands made her uneasy. What if it was an emergency? What if someone on the other end of that call needed help? Janelle crouched down, her practical nature warring with her instinct to avoid involvement. She picked up the phone carefully, as if it might explode, and brought it close to her ear. At first she heard only static and the ambient noise of wherever the other caller was located. Then a voice came through. Male. Controlled, but urgent. Confirm the package is secure. Magnetic clamp, chassis mount, passenger side. The target will be mobile in 15 minutes. When he gets in, the pressure trigger activates. Clean, untraceable, looks like engine failure. Janelle's blood went cold. She should hang up. She should drop the phone and walk away. But her hand wouldn't move. Another voice responded, younger, nervous. What about the crew? They'll tear the city apart looking for whoever did this. That's the point. Let them. We frame the West Side boys, they retaliate, and in the chaos, we take over 3 territories. The target's too confident, too visible. Makes him easy. And if someone sees us? Nobody's looking at the car. Everyone's watching him. By the time anyone realizes what happened, we're ghosts. The first voice dropped lower. Almost a whisper. The device is live. Timer's set for motion activation. Once he shifts the car into drive, he's got maybe 30 seconds. Now get clear and dump your phone. The line went dead. Janelle stood frozen, the cheap plastic phone still pressed to her ear, her mind racing to process what she'd just heard. A bomb. Someone had planted a bomb on a car. A man was going to die in 15 minutes unless someone warned him. She should call the police. That was the rational response. Call 911, report what she'd heard, let professionals handle it. But what had she actually heard? A one-sided conversation on a stranger's phone about something that might not even be happening in this park, in this city. The police would think she was insane. By the time she convinced anyone to take her seriously, it would be too late. Her hands shook as she lifted her gaze from the phone to the park around her, searching for anything that matched what the voice had described. A car. A target with a crew. Someone about to leave. And then she saw it. 50 yards ahead, near the park's eastern entrance where the pathway met the street, a black Mercedes sedan sat parked with military precision. Its chrome accents caught the late afternoon sun. Even from this distance, Janelle could see the vehicle was expensive, immaculate, the kind of car that made a statement about its owner. Around it stood 5 men in dark suits positioned with the casual alertness of professional security. And beside the rear passenger door, checking his phone with one tattooed hand resting on the car's roof, stood a man she recognized. Not personally, she'd never met him. But she knew his face the way everyone in the city knew his face, through whispered warnings and carefully avoided conversations. Dominic Santoro, the Don, the man someone had just planted a bomb under. Janelle's vision tunneled. The sounds of the park faded to a dull roar in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to pretend she'd heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing. She could drop the phone, walk in the opposite direction, and be home in 10 minutes. Safe, invisible. Exactly how she'd spent her entire adult life trying to be. But a man was about to die, and she was the only person in the world who knew it. The burner phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered back onto the concrete. Janelle looked down at it, then back at the black sedan, at Dominic Santoro pocketing his phone and turning toward the car door. 15 minutes, the voice had said. but based on Santoro's body language, he was leaving right now. Janelle's legs moved before her brain could authorize the decision. One step, then another, each one feeling like moving through water, fighting against the current of her own terror. Her canvas bag banged against her hip with each step, the familiar weight suddenly foreign. The 50 yards between her and the Mercedes felt like miles. She had no plan, no script, no idea what she was going to say or how she was going to say it. All she knew was that in approximately 60 seconds, a man was going to get into a car that would kill him, and she was the only person who could stop it. Santoro's hand was on the door handle when Janelle's voice finally broke free, raw with panic and desperation, cutting through the autumn air with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Wait! Look under your car!" The moment the words left her mouth, Janelle wanted to take them back, every head turned toward her in perfect synchronization. The 5 men in dark suits, the handful of pedestrians nearby, and Dominic Santoro himself, his pale eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. Her legs began to shake. Not the subtle tremor of nervousness, but the violent, uncontrollable shaking that signaled her body was preparing to either collapse or run. The logical part of her brain, the part that had kept her safe for 23 years by avoiding exactly this kind of attention, screamed a single command: flee. She could do it. Just turn and sprint into the park's interior, lose herself in the network of pathways and trees, disappear into the anonymity she'd spent her entire life cultivating. These men didn't know her name. They'd never seen her before. She could vanish, and in 10 minutes, this would be someone else's problem, someone else's nightmare. Janelle's right foot actually shifted backward, her body making the decision her conscious mind couldn't quite commit to. She felt the panic attack building in her chest like a physical weight, crushing her lungs, making each breath shorter and more desperate than the last. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. This was a mistake. She'd made a terrible, possibly fatal mistake. But then, unbidden, a memory surfaced with perfect, devastating clarity. 18 months ago, sitting at her mother's kitchen table at 2 a.m, watching her mother cry over a stack of bills she couldn't pay, medical debt from Janelle's father, who'd died 3 years earlier after a brutal fight with cancer that had consumed their savings, their home equity, everything. Her mother's small bookkeeping business, the one she'd built from nothing over 15 years, was drowning. Eviction notices, creditor calls, the kind of debt that didn't disappear, that followed you like a shadow, that destroyed lives, one late payment at a time. Janelle had felt so helpless, watching her mother, the strongest person she'd ever known, reduced to exhausted sobs at a kitchen table covered in red stamped envelopes. 3 days later, the envelope had arrived. No return address. A cashier's check inside for $38,000. The exact amount needed to clear the business debt, plus enough to cover 2 months of operating expenses, and a business card, heavy stock, embossed text. The debt is forgiven. No repayment expected. Signed only with the initials DS. Her mother had been terrified at first, certain it was a scam or a mistake, or the beginning of something worse. But the check had cleared. The debt had vanished. And when her mother had quietly asked around, when she'd made discreet inquiries through the small business network she'd cultivated over the years, 3 other people had similar stories. Anonymous payments, medical bills cleared, rent covered for families facing eviction. Always unsigned, always just enough, always traced back, through whispers and careful speculation, to the same source. Dominic Santoro didn't advertise his occasional mercy. It didn't fit his carefully maintained reputation, but he did it anyway, for reasons Janelle didn't understand, and probably never would. Her mother had made her promise never to speak of it, to pretend it had never happened, to avoid anything that might connect them to a man like that. "We don't owe him anything," her mother had insisted, though her voice had wavered with something that sounded like shame. "Men like that don't do kindness without strings." But standing here watching Santoro's hand still resting on the car door handle, Watching him assess her with those cold, calculating eyes, Janelle realized her mother had been wrong. They did owe him. She owed him. He'd saved her mother when he had no reason to, when doing so gained him nothing, when his reputation would have been better served by letting another small business fail in a city full of them. He'd chosen mercy. Now she had to choose courage. Janelle forced her right foot forward instead of back, then her left. The panic attack still clawed at her chest, still threatened to drag her under, but she pushed through it like walking into a freezing river. One step. Another. The 20 remaining yards between her and the Mercedes stretched ahead like an impossible distance, but she kept moving. Santoro hadn't looked away. Neither had his security. She was committed now. There was no turning back. The massive bodyguard intercepted her when she was still 15 feet from the Mercedes. He moved with surprising speed for someone his size, positioning himself between Janelle and Santoro with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Up close, he was even more intimidating than from a distance. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and his shoulders were broad enough to block her entire view of the car. "That's far enough." His voice was surprisingly quiet, almost gentle, but carried an unmistakable note of warning. "You need to move along, miss." Janelle's voice came out as a whisper. "I need to talk to him." The bodyguard's expression didn't change. "No, you don't. Keep walking." She tried to step around him, but he shifted with her, maintaining the barrier between her and his employer. "Please," Janelle said, louder now, desperation bleeding into her tone. "Please, it's important. It's urgent." "I'm sure it is." His hand moved subtly toward his jacket interior. "But Mr. Santoro doesn't take meetings on the street. You want to speak with him? You go through proper channels." Proper channels. As if she could just call an office, schedule an appointment, wait 3 weeks for a consultation with the city's most powerful crime boss. The absurdity of it might have been funny if there weren't a bomb counting down beneath the car 20 feet away. "There's no time for that." Janelle's hands were shaking so badly she had to clutch her messenger bag with both arms to keep them still. "Something's wrong. Something's really wrong with the car. Please, just listen to me." The bodyguard's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his expression shifted from bored professionalism to active suspicion. "Step back, now." Behind him, she could see Santoro watching the exchange with detached curiosity. He'd released the door handle and was leaning against the Mercedes, arms crossed, apparently content to let his security handle the situation. 2 of the other suited men had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle that boxed her in. Janelle felt the panic rising again, threatening to choke off her words entirely. She was failing. She was going to stand here stammering at a wall of muscle and expensive suits, while a man died 15 feet away, and it would be her fault for not being brave enough, strong enough, loud enough to make them listen. The thought ignited something in her chest. Not courage exactly, but a kind of desperate fury at her own limitations, at the anxiety that had controlled her life for so long, at the unfairness of finally trying to do something right, only to be dismissed like a vagrant begging for change. "There's a bomb under your car!" The words exploded out of her at a volume she didn't know she possessed. Every conversation in the immediate vicinity stopped. Pedestrians froze mid-stride. Even the bodyguard looked momentarily startled by the raw desperation in her voice. Santoro straightened from his casual lean against the Mercedes. "Silas," he said quietly, and the bodyguard immediately stepped aside. The Don walked toward her with measured steps, and Janelle realized with sinking certainty that she'd just used the word bomb in a crowded public space while addressing a known criminal. If this went wrong, if he didn't believe her, she wasn't just going to be dismissed. She was going to be arrested. Or worse. Santoro stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the intricate details of the tattoos climbing his neck, the cold assessment in his pale blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice was soft, controlled, dangerous. "Repeat that." Janelle's throat had gone completely dry. She swallowed hard, forced herself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to apologize, to run. "There's something wired to the frame," she said, her voice steadier now despite the terror coursing through her. "Under the car, passenger side, magnetic clamp. It's going to activate when you start driving. I heard them talking about it. You have to look." Santoro's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation. Recognition, perhaps, that no one would approach him with this specific a warning unless they genuinely believed it. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nobody," Janelle whispered. "I'm nobody, but I'm telling you the truth." Santoro studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Janelle could feel Silas tensing beside her, waiting for some signal from his employer. The other security personnel had moved closer, forming a tighter perimeter that made escape impossible, even if she'd wanted to try. "Silas," Santoro said quietly, not taking his eyes off Janelle, "remove her from the premises." The massive bodyguard reached for her arm, his grip firm but not painful. Janelle tried to pull away, desperation flooding her system. "No, wait, please, I'm not crazy. I heard them on a phone. They said magnetic clamp, chassis mount, pressure trigger. They said when you shift into drive, you'd have 30 seconds. Please, you have to believe me." Silas lifted her easily, turning her away from the car. "Come on, miss. Let's not make this difficult." "Stop." Santoro's single word carried absolute authority. Silas froze immediately, still holding Janelle's arm, but no longer moving her away. The Don stepped closer, his attention now fully focused on her face, searching for something in her expression. "How do you know those terms?" His voice had dropped lower, quieter, more dangerous. "Magnetic clamp, chassis mount, those aren't things civilians talk about." "I don't know anything about bombs," Janelle said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I just heard them. 2 men, or maybe 1 man on a phone call. He dropped it in the park, and I heard everything. They said the package was secure, that it would look like engine failure, that nobody would be looking at the car because everyone would be watching you." Something shifted in Santoro's expression. Not belief exactly, but a willingness to consider the possibility. He glanced past her, his eyes scanning the park perimeter with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years looking for threats. That's when Janelle saw it too. A black SUV with heavily tinted windows was cruising slowly along the street that bordered the park's eastern edge. It wasn't driving like normal traffic. It was prowling, the vehicle moving at barely 15 miles per hour, its trajectory aimed directly toward where they stood. Santoro tracked the SUV with his eyes, his body language shifting from casual authority to coiled readiness. He raised one hand in a subtle gesture, and instantly his security team repositioned, 2 men moving to flank the Mercedes, while the others scanned the surrounding area with heightened alertness. The SUV continued its slow approach, then stopped approximately 50 yards away, engine still running. Windows reflecting the late afternoon sun in a way that made it impossible to see inside. It just sat there, idling, watching. "Who sent you?" Santoro's question was barely above a whisper now, but the steel in his voice made Janelle's stomach clench. "Don't lie to me. Who are you working for?" "Nobody sent me," Janelle insisted, her voice cracking. "I work at the History Museum on Kensington Street. I catalog documents. That's all I do. I was walking home through the park, and this man dropped his phone, and I heard the conversation, and then I saw your car, and I just knew. I knew it was you they were talking about. I'm not lying. I swear, I'm not lying." Santoro's jaw tightened. He looked again at the idling SUV, then back at Janelle, then down at his own Mercedes. The calculation happening behind his eyes was almost visible. weighing risk against paranoia, her credibility against the very specific details she'd provided. "How long ago did you hear this conversation?" he asked. "Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. They said you'd be mobile in 15 minutes, but that was before I ran over here." Another vehicle, a dark sedan, had appeared at the park's opposite entrance, also moving slowly, also watching. Santoro noticed it immediately. His security team did too, their hands moving to their concealed weapons without drawing them, their formation tightening around their employer. "Silas," Santoro said, his voice carrying deadly calm. "Check the car." The bodyguard hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Boss, if she's setting us up, if this is a distraction, then we'll deal with it." Santoro's eyes never left Janelle's face. "But if she's telling the truth and we ignore it, we won't get the chance. Check the car. Now." The crowd had already begun to gather. Word of a confrontation involving Dominic Santoro spread through the park like wildfire. People emerged from pathways and benches drawn by the tension, by the idling vehicles that clearly didn't belong, by the sight of a young woman standing toe-to-toe with men everyone knew better than to approach. Cell phones appeared, screens glowing as people began recording from what they thought was a safe distance. Santoro noticed the growing audience immediately. His expression tightened, but after a moment of calculation, Janelle saw something unexpected cross his face. Not frustration at the attention, but recognition of an opportunity. "Everyone with a phone," Santoro called out, his voice carrying across the park with natural authority. "Keep recording. I want witnesses to whatever happens next." Janelle felt her stomach drop. She understood the strategy even as it terrified her. If the device was real, the recordings would document that he'd been targeted, that someone had tried to kill him in broad daylight. If the device wasn't real, if she'd somehow misunderstood or been set up herself, those same recordings would document his response to a false threat. Either way, he was protecting himself through public accountability. It was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. Silas moved toward the Mercedes with visible reluctance, his skepticism etched into every line of his scarred face. He crouched down near the rear passenger door, pulling a small flashlight from his jacket pocket. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, capturing every moment. "Passenger side," Janelle said, her voice barely audible. "That's what they said. Passenger side, chassis mount." Silas shot her a look that could have melted steel, but he shifted his position, moving to the opposite side of the vehicle. He lowered himself flat onto his back and slid partially under the car, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows beneath the chassis. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it could only have been 30 seconds. Janelle watched Santoro's face, trying to read his expression, but he'd gone completely blank. The other security personnel maintained their vigilant scanning of the perimeter, tracking the 2 suspicious vehicles that continued their slow patrol of the park's borders. Then Silas went completely still under the car. Even from where Janelle stood, she could see the change in his body language, the way his entire frame tensed. "Boss," Silas called out, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "We have a problem." Santoro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Describe it." Silas slid out from under the Mercedes, his hands moving with careful deliberation as he stood. His face had gone pale beneath his olive complexion, and when he spoke, he addressed Santoro in a voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "Black box, approximately 6 by 4 inches. Military-grade magnetic clamp, wiring visible. Looks professional." He paused, his eyes cutting briefly to Janelle before returning to his employer. She was right. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was immediate. Phones repositioned, zoomed in, captured Silas's grim expression and Santoro's stone-faced reaction. Janelle felt her knees go weak with relief and residual terror. She'd been right. The threat was real. But that also meant the men in those vehicles, whoever they were, had just watched their plan exposed. Santoro stepped closer to Silas, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Can you identify it? Silas hesitated, then nodded slowly. The clamp has a maker's mark, custom work. I've only seen it once before, about 6 months ago when we were evaluating new security measures. He met Santoro's eyes with an expression that carried layers of meaning Janelle couldn't decipher. It's Luca's supplier, the one he kept recommending we switch to for vehicle protection. Said they did cutting-edge work. The name meant nothing to Janelle, but she watched Santoro's face transform for just a fraction of a second. Not surprise, but a cold, terrible understanding. A betrayal confirmed rather than suspected. Luca, Santoro repeated quietly, and the single word carried the weight of a death sentence. He looked up at the surrounding crowd, at the dozens of phones still recording, at the 2 suspicious vehicles that had now begun a slow retreat from their positions. When he turned back to Janelle, his expression had shifted into something she couldn't quite read. "What's your name?" he asked. "Janelle," she whispered. "Janelle Doyle." "Miss Doyle," Santoro said, loud enough for the nearby phones to capture. "You just saved my life." The moment Santoro acknowledged the device publicly, everything happened at once. Then, the black SUV that had been idling 50 yards away suddenly accelerated, its tires screeching against the pavement as it attempted a sharp U-turn. The dark sedan at the opposite entrance did the same, both vehicles abandoning their patient surveillance in favor of immediate escape. Santoro didn't even need to give an order. 2 of his security personnel were already moving, sprinting toward their own vehicles parked along the street. A sleek gray sedan roared to life and shot forward, cutting off the SUV's escape route with precision that spoke to extensive tactical training. The SUV swerved, nearly clipping a parked car, but the driver managed to correct and continue down the street at dangerous speed. The crowd scattered, people screaming and diving for cover behind benches and trees. Janelle stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the sudden transformation from tense standoff to active pursuit. Silas moved immediately to position himself between her and the fleeing vehicles, his massive frame serving as a human shield. "Stay down," he commanded, but Janelle couldn't move. She watched the gray sedan chase the SUV through the park's perimeter, watched the dark sedan from the opposite entrance attempt to flee in the other direction, only to find its path blocked by a third vehicle she hadn't even noticed arrive. Santoro's organization operated with the coordination of a military unit, every person knowing their role without needing explicit instruction. Then came the sirens. Police cruisers appeared from multiple directions, lights flashing, their arrival either remarkably quick or suspiciously convenient. Janelle couldn't tell which. They formed a loose perimeter around the park's entrance, officers emerging with hands on their holsters, their attention immediately drawn to the fleeing vehicles and the obvious signs of a confrontation in progress. A sergeant approached the Mercedes cautiously, his eyes moving from the device still attached to the underside of the vehicle to Santoro standing calm and collected near the rear door, to Silas positioned protectively, to Janelle trembling behind them both. "Nobody move," the sergeant ordered, though his voice carried uncertainty. He was clearly trying to assess which of the many laws being broken here took priority. "Santoro, step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Santoro complied smoothly, raising both hands to chest height, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Sergeant Brennan," he said, his tone pleasant despite the circumstances. "I think you'll find we're the victims here, not the perpetrators." "That's for us to determine." Brennan nodded to 2 of his officers who approached the Mercedes with bomb detection equipment. "Someone want to tell me what's happening?" Santoro gestured toward Janelle with one raised hand. "This young woman overheard a conversation detailing a planned assassination, mine specifically. She had the courage to warn me despite considerable personal risk. My security confirmed the presence of an explosive device attached to my vehicle, at which point the actual perpetrators attempted to flee." He pointed down the street where the chase was still visible in the distance. Black SUV, license plate Hotel Tango 749 Romeo. Dark sedan, license plate Bravo Charlie 326 Lima. Both vehicles were conducting surveillance before the device was discovered. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. You're telling me someone tried to blow you up in broad daylight in a public park? I'm telling you someone planted a military-grade explosive device on my vehicle with the intention of making it look like mechanical failure. Santoro's voice remained perfectly calm. The evidence is under the car. The suspects are currently fleeing. I suggest you prioritize their apprehension before they disappear entirely. Brennan spoke into his radio, relaying the license plate numbers and vehicle descriptions. Within seconds, additional units were being dispatched to intercept. He turned back to Santoro, his expression skeptical but professional. We'll need statements from everyone present, including you. Of course. Santoro lowered his hands slowly. I'm happy to cooperate fully, as is Miss Doyle, who witnessed the initial planning conversation and whose quick thinking prevented a tragedy. The sergeant's attention shifted to Janelle for the first time, really looking at her. She knew what he saw, a young woman in a denim jacket and jeans, clearly terrified, clutching a canvas messenger bag like a lifeline, about as far from a criminal operative as possible. Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me to give a statement, Brennan said, his tone gentler than it had been with Santoro. Can you tell me your name? Janelle's voice came out as barely a whisper. Janelle Doyle. All right, Miss Doyle, let's step over here where it's safer. Sergeant Brennan led Janelle to a patrol car parked 30 feet from the Mercedes, away from the growing chaos of the bomb squad's arrival and the forensic team's initial assessment. She sat in the back seat with the door open, her legs dangling out, while the sergeant stood with a notepad and a patient expression that suggested he'd heard thousands of statements over his career. Start from the beginning, he said. When did you first become aware of the threat? Janelle's mind felt sluggish, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation now draining away, and leaving only exhaustion in its wake. She forced herself to focus, to construct a version of events that was true, but simplified enough to be believable. I was walking home from work through the park, she began, her voice hoarse. A man bumped into me and dropped his phone. I picked it up to return it, but he was already gone. The phone was still connected to a call, and I could hear someone talking about a device, about a car, about timing. They mentioned magnetic clamps and chassis mounts and pressure triggers. Brennan scribbled notes without looking up. Did you recognize either voice? No, I'd never heard them before. And you immediately associated this conversation with Mr. Santoro's vehicle? Janelle nodded, though the question made her realize how implausible her story sounded when reduced to simple facts. I saw the car and I saw him standing next to it, and the timing matched what they'd said on the phone. I just knew it was connected. Where's the phone now? The questions stopped her cold. She'd dropped it on the pathway when she'd run toward the Mercedes. I left it in the park. I can show you where. Brennan made another note. We'll retrieve it. Can you describe the man who dropped it? Janelle provided what details she could remember. Middle-aged, nervous, ill-fitting jacket, sweating despite the cool temperature. As she spoke, her attention drifted past the sergeant to where Santoro stood near his vehicle, still surrounded by his security team but now also hemmed in by police and bomb technicians. She watched as one of Santoro's men, the younger one with sleeve tattoos, crouched down beside Silas near the Mercedes. The police were occupied with securing the perimeter and documenting the scene, their attention focused on the larger threat. In that brief window of distraction, she saw the younger man reach up into the undercarriage with what looked like needle-nose pliers, saw him extract something small and metallic, saw him pass it to Silas with a gesture so subtle she almost missed it. Silas examined the object, then immediately moved to Santoro's side, leaning in close to whisper something. Even from 30 feet away, Janelle could see Santoro's expression change. Not surprise, but a deepening of the cold fury that had been building since the device's discovery. Miss Doyle? Brennan's voice pulled her attention back. Are you all right? Yes, sorry. She forced herself to focus on the sergeant rather than whatever silent communication was happening near the Mercedes. I'm just tired. Almost done. Did you notice anyone else in the park acting suspiciously? Anyone who seemed to be watching Mr. Santoro or his vehicle? Janelle thought about the two vehicles that had appeared during the confrontation. The way they'd prowled the perimeter before fleeing. She described them as best she could, though her memory felt unreliable, everything blurring together into one continuous rush of fear and confusion. Brennan closed his notepad after another 10 minutes of questions. That's enough for now. We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to sign your official statement, but you're free to go. Do you need a ride home? No, I can walk. The thought of getting into another vehicle, even a police car, made her stomach turn. I live close by. All right, here's my card. If you remember anything else, call me directly. He handed her a business card with the precinct's contact information, then turned to rejoin the organized chaos surrounding the Mercedes. Janelle stood on shaking legs, clutching the card and her messenger bag, suddenly aware of how isolated she felt. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation had largely dispersed, chased away by police establishing a wider perimeter. The officers were focused on evidence collection and witness interviews. Santoro and his team were still engaged in tense conversation near the vehicle, their body language suggesting internal discussion rather than cooperation with authorities. She was alone, standing on a sidewalk in a park that had been peaceful 40 minutes ago, having just prevented an assassination and exposed herself to dangers she couldn't even fully comprehend. The adrenaline crash hit like a physical blow. Her hands started trembling so violently she nearly dropped her bag. Her vision tunneled, and she had to brace herself against a nearby tree to keep from collapsing. The panic attack she'd been fighting off through sheer willpower finally overwhelmed her defenses, and she slid down to sit on the cold ground, gasping for breath. Janelle didn't know how long she sat there against the tree, trying to force air into her lungs through the crushing weight of the panic attack. Minutes, maybe. Long enough for her vision to start clearing, for the desperate gasping to slow into something closer to normal breathing. She pressed her forehead against her knees, willing her body to stop shaking, willing the world to stop spinning. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with purposeful coordination. Janelle looked up to find Santoro standing 10 feet away, Silas and two other security personnel flanking him in a loose formation. The police were still occupied near the Mercedes, and somehow Santoro had extracted himself from their immediate supervision long enough to cross the distance to where she sat. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. His expression was unreadable, those pale eyes assessing her with the same intensity he'd shown during their first confrontation near the car. Janelle wondered if he could see how completely she was falling apart, if the trembling was as visible as it felt, if her tear-streaked face betrayed just how terrified she'd been and still was. "Miss Doyle," Santoro said finally, his voice carrying none of the hardness she'd heard earlier. "May I speak with you?" Janelle nodded, not trusting her voice. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Santoro gestured, and immediately Silas moved forward, offering his hand. The massive bodyguard who'd initially tried to remove her from the scene now helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered. Santoro stepped closer, close enough that their conversation would be private despite the security personnel nearby. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Janelle's heart stuttered, some irrational part of her brain still convinced this was the moment everything went wrong. But what he withdrew was small, metallic, catching the fading afternoon light. A keycard, simple, unmarked except for a small embossed symbol she didn't recognize. "You did something today that very few people would have the courage to do," Santoro said, holding the card between them. "You put yourself in danger to warn someone you had every reason to fear. Someone you had no obligation to protect." "You helped my mother," Janelle heard herself say, the words emerging before she could stop them. "When her business was failing, the envelope with no return address, that was you." Something flickered across Santoro's face. Not surprise, but perhaps recognition that his carefully anonymous generosity hadn't been as anonymous as he'd intended. That was a different situation. No, it wasn't. Janelle's voice grew steadier as she spoke, the panic attack's grip loosening slightly. You helped someone when you didn't have to. When it gained you nothing. I did the same thing today. Santoro studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right. He extended the keycard toward her. This provides access to a building on Sullivan Street. 3rd floor, apartment 3F. It's registered to a trust, completely untraceable to either of us. If you ever need somewhere safe, if anyone ever tries to use today's events against you, that's your sanctuary. Janelle took the card with trembling fingers. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with implications she was still too shaken to fully process. More than that, Santoro continued, his voice dropping lower. You're under my protection now. You risked everything for me. That creates a debt, Miss Doyle, an unpayable debt, which means you're untouchable. Anyone who threatens you, anyone who tries to harm you because of what happened here today, answers to me. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Janelle understood. She was being offered something people in this city paid fortunes for, and still never truly received: the protection of Dominic Santoro. It should have terrified her more than anything else that had happened today. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her panic. I understand, she said quietly. Good. Santoro glanced back toward the Mercedes, where the bomb squad was still working. The police will want to speak with you again. Answer their questions honestly, but don't mention this conversation or that card. As far as anyone knows, you're simply a witness who happened to overhear something and had the courage to act on it. That's what I am, Janelle said. No. Santoro met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. That's what you were. Now you're something different. Someone who understands that real courage has nothing to do with size or strength or title. It's about doing what's right despite the fear. He stepped back, creating distance between them once more. Silas and the other security personnel moved with him, their formation protective but no longer threatening. Santoro paused, looking back at her one final time. Take care of yourself, Miss Doyle, and remember, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Then he turned and walked back toward the Mercedes, leaving Janelle standing alone with a keycard clutched in her hand and the weight of an impossible debt settling onto her shoulders like armor she'd never asked for but somehow knew she'd earned. 5 days passed before Janelle felt steady enough to return to work. She'd called in sick the day after the incident, her supervisor accepting her explanation of a stomach virus without question. The truth was that she'd spent the entire day in her apartment, alternating between exhausted sleep and anxious pacing, her mind replaying every moment of the confrontation in obsessive detail. The story had made the news, of course. Local stations ran segments about the attempted assassination of a known organized crime figure in broad daylight. The police statement was carefully worded, mentioning a concerned citizen who'd reported suspicious activity but withholding Janelle's name. She'd gone to the station the following day to sign her official statement, enduring another 2 hours of questions from detectives who seemed torn between gratitude and suspicion. By day 3, the story had mostly faded from the news cycle, replaced by more recent scandals and tragedies. The city moved on. Life continued. And Janelle was left to figure out what her life looked like now. When she finally walked back into the museum on Monday morning, everything looked exactly as she'd left it. The same beige walls, the same fluorescent lighting, the same hushed atmosphere of a place where history was preserved behind glass and carefully controlled humidity. Her desk in the archives room was untouched, her half-finished cataloging project waiting exactly where she'd abandoned it. But Janelle felt different. Fundamentally, irrevocably different. The visiting scholar who'd questioned her work the previous week stopped by her desk around noon, offering what might have been an apology disguised as professional courtesy. "I reviewed your citations on the letter attribution," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Your analysis was correct. Well done." A week ago, Janelle would have accepted this with a quiet thank you and burning cheeks, would have hidden in the bathroom afterward to process the interaction alone. Today, she looked at him directly and said, "I know it was correct. I don't make mistakes with my research." The scholar blinked, surprised by her tone, then nodded and retreated to whatever other projects occupied his time. Janelle turned back to her work, feeling something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not arrogance, but simple confidence. She was good at her job. She didn't need external validation to know that. Her supervisor noticed the change too. By Wednesday, he'd assigned her a more complex project, one that required presenting findings to the museum's board of directors at the end of the month. The old Janelle would have panicked at the prospect of public speaking. This version simply accepted the assignment and began preparing her materials. That evening, walking home through streets that had once seemed vaguely threatening in their crowded anonymity, Janelle found herself thinking about the key card in her wallet. She'd transferred it from her messenger bag to a more secure location, keeping it hidden behind her driver's license, where she could feel its slight weight every time she checked for identification. She hadn't used it yet. Hadn't even driven past the address on Sullivan Street to see what the building looked like. Part of her wanted to pretend the whole thing had been some fever dream, that she'd imagined Santoro's quiet promise of protection and the impossible debt he claimed she'd earned. But another part of her, the part that had walked toward a bomb and faced down the city's most dangerous man, knew it was real, knew that her life had been fundamentally altered in ways she was still discovering. On Thursday evening, a week after the incident, Janelle's route home took her past Riverside Park again. She'd avoided it for days, but tonight she felt ready to face it. The park looked peaceful in the early evening light. Joggers and dog walkers moving through familiar patterns, children playing on equipment that seemed impossibly carefree. She walked along the same pathway she'd taken that Thursday afternoon, past the oak tree where she'd pressed herself in panic, past the spot where the Mercedes had been parked. The bomb squad had taken the vehicle for evidence analysis. The police tape was gone now. There was nothing to indicate that anything significant had happened here, except her own memories. Janelle paused where she'd sat during her panic attack, where Santoro had approached her with the key card and the weight of an unpayable debt. She thought about the person she'd been a week ago. Anxious, afraid, spending her entire life trying to be invisible. That person still existed somewhere inside her, still felt the familiar tightness in her chest when confronted with uncertainty. But that person was no longer in control. She'd learned something that Thursday afternoon. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite the terror, doing what needed to be done, even when every instinct screamed to run. And once you'd done it once you'd proven to yourself that you could face the impossible and survive, something shifted. The world didn't become less dangerous, but you became less powerless within it. Janelle turned to continue home, and that's when she saw it. A block down the street, moving with predatory grace through evening traffic, the black Mercedes sedan. It wasn't speeding, wasn't making any obvious gestures, just driving past at a normal speed, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the city. But she knew. Somehow she knew Santoro was aware of her walking this route, knew he'd positioned someone to ensure she made it home safely. The protection he'd promised wasn't abstract, it was real, tangible, a shadow that would follow her through the city's streets, whether she acknowledged it or not. The Mercedes disappeared around a corner, its red taillights fading into the evening traffic. Janelle watched it go, then turned toward her apartment with steady steps. The city was still dangerous. She understood that better than most. But the fear that had once controlled her had been replaced by something quieter, fiercer, more permanent. Knowledge, power. the certainty that she'd earned her place in this world through courage rather than compliance. And somewhere in the darkness behind her, a promise rode silent and protective, keeping watch. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.